Today's daf is daf Yud Dalid, and we'll begin on the bottom of Yud Gimel Amud Beis, 2.5 lines up before the end of the Omud, Lema Kitanoi, and we're going back to Rav Mori, and that has to do with the avoda of what's called the Chatas HaPnimis, that has to be brought from outside the Heichal into the Heichal, and there the Zrika is done on the Mizbeach HaPnimi, which is called the Mizbach HaZohav, and he has to dip his finger into the dam and then apply the dam to the Mizbeach. Now, what is the status of the Kohen dipping his finger into the dam? Is that also called an avoda, such that if he has a machsheves shelo lishma at that moment, that would passel the korban, because a chatos, in a case where the avoda was done shelo lishma, is possible. So the Gemara is now suggesting lema ketanoi, that this issue about whether to define the dipping of the finger into the dam in the case of chatas pnimis as an avoda or not is an issue that is the subject of a controversy amongst Tanoim. The Tani Chad, according to one brisa, Tvilas etzba mefagelas bechatas. That means that if at the time that the Kohen dips his finger into the dam of a chatas pnimis, he has in mind that the zrika should be done li'achar zmano, beyond the allotted time, that makes the korban into pigul. Pigul is something which is not only possible, but if you eat from the pigul, you're chayav kares, a very severe iser. Now, another form of pigul, which we should mention here as well, would be if he has in mind that the avarim that have to be burnt on the mizbeach should be burnt on the mizbeach the next day, which is after the time allotment. And then, since this brisa reflects the shita that tvilas etzba is an avoda, therefore it would become pigul if he had that in mind. However, Tanyid, if we have another brisa that says lo mefageles v'lo mispageles, that such a machshava of the Kohen at the moment that he does the tvilas etzba would not generate a psul and an iser achilas basar bekares of pigul, because apparently the second brisa that we're studying right now holds that tvilas etzba is not called an avoda, and then the brisa, the second brisa that we're learning now, adds velo mispageles, and that seems to mean that the korban does not become pigul, and mifagelis means he did not actively make it into pigul. My lav tanoihi. Lo, the Gemara rejects it. Everybody agrees that tvilas etzba is an avoda. Harabanan, Harabi Shimon. The Rabbanan are of the opinion that this kind of an avoda, which brings the korban closer to the mizbeach, is an avoda that generates with the machshava of the Kohen pigul. Rabbi Shimon, on the other hand, says that you only could create pigul in an avodas hadam, and tvilas etzba is not called avodas hadam. It's only an avoda that brings the dam closer to the mizbeach. So the Gemara rejects this. Rabbi Shimon, my iriya tvilas etzba, and here we start today's daf Yudalid. Ha'omar, Rabbi Shimon was of the opinion that kol she'eno ala mizbeach hachitzon kishlomim ein bo mishum pigul. In other words, Rabbi Shimon doesn't have pigul at all in the case of a chatas hapnimis. He only has a pigul because the paradigmic source of pigul in the Torah is Shlomim, the parish of Shlomim, and Shlomim, says Rabbi Shimon, has a zrika on the mizbeach hachitzon, mizbeach hanechoshes, outside the heichal in the azara, and any korban that doesn't have an avoda of dam on the mizbeach hachitzon, but only on the mizbeach hapnimi, is not subject to the law of pigul, because it's not similar to Shlomim, which is your paradigmic case of pigul. So therefore, why do you focus here in this brisa on the issue of Tvilas Etzba? Forget about Tvilas Etzba. According to Rabbi Shimon, any avoda whatsoever, it does not lend itself, in the case of Achatas Pnimis, to pigul. Ella, but rather, the Gemara says, no. You know what? Hava harabanan, even though we have what seems to be a contradiction in the two brisos, lo kasha, kan bechatas achitzonios, bechan bechatas apnimios. The brisa that says that tfilas etzba is mufka, it's completely excluded from pigul, that's referring to a chatos chitzona, which makes it just the opposite of what we said in Reb Shimon. But the first brisa that says that you could effectuate pigul at the moment of tfilas etzba, that's in a chatos pnimis. Because with regard to the regular classic chatos hachitzona, the Torah says, "V'lokacha kohen midama chatos b'etzba'o, v'nasan al kardos mizbach ha'ola." Mizbach ha'ola is another phrase in the Torah for mizbach hanechoshes, to mizbeach hachitzona. So when it says in the pasuk, "V'lokacha kohen midam hachatos," that's tvilas etzba. But yet, the Gemara is going to say that this is referring to Kabbalas Hadam, not to Tfilas Etzba. So Rashi says that the pasuk means that the Kohen will be Makabel the dam of a chatos in a Kli Shares, and then with his finger he places the dam on the Karnos HaMizbeach. So therefore the pasuk itself is not referring specifically to dipping his finger, but rather to receiving the dam in a kli and then placing it on the kranos hamizbeach, but not dipping his finger into the dam. Now, since the Kohen has to apply the dam to the mizbeach, and he can only do that with his finger, obviously he first has to have tfilas dam. He has to, put his finger into the blood. But it's only a machshir. It's only a step in the direction of ultimately doing the zrika. It's not an avoda per se, and therefore tfilas etzba would not generate pigul if he has a machshavas pigul in the case of a chatas hachitzona. However, with regard to a chatas hapnimis, there the Torah specifically requires tfilas etzba, and therefore it's effectually an avoda which generates pigul. The Gemara is not happy with this. Why? Because why did the Bryce have to tell me chatos achitzona? That in that case, there's no machsheves pigul in tfilas etzba pshita. Gemara says lo ksiv behu v'taval. The Torah deliberately avoided using the phrase v'taval, that he has to dip his finger into the dam, whereas in contrast, in chatos hapnimis, the Torah requires beferish v'tava. Itzrich. Salkedait chamina, I would have had a havamina that ho ksiv v'lokach, since with regard to the chatos hachitzona, it says v'lokach, and what does v'lokach mean? Iosi kof romi le'adiode boy lemishkal zimnach riti. And the Torah says v'lakach, meaning the Kohen has to actively take the dam from the kli, and that implies that if a monkey comes along and puts the blood on the Kohen's hands, then the Kohen would still have to take more blood because there's no velokach. It was done by the kof. And therefore, commanded chsiv v'taval dam, even though it doesn't say explicitly v'taval, but we understand from the fact that it says velokach that he has to be tovel his finger. That the Torah deliberately avoided use of the term v'taval and instead chose the term velokach, meaning it could be understood either as dipping the finger in or as somehow getting the dam over to the mizbeach. And as we said before, even though he can't do so without dipping his finger into the dam, because he's got to place the dam on the mizbeach with his finger, in the case of a chatas achitzono. So the Torah used this term, which could be understood in two ways, but it could also be understood as avoiding the word v'taval to indicate that the tvilas etzba is not considered a necessary avodah. It's only a hechsher to get the dam onto the mizbeach. And therefore, in the case of chatos chitzonos, where the tvilas etzba is only a hechsher, it's only a technicality, therefore there's no machshavas pigul. Okay, now we go on to the Mishnah. The Mishnah says that Rabbi Shimon machshav behiluch, meaning Rabbi Shimon holds that any so-called avodah that could be avoided, meaning there's a way of circumventing it and not needing it. For example, hiluch, because if the Kohen would shecht the carbon right next to the mizbech, he doesn't have to bring the dam to the mizbech. He's right there. You just have to do the zrika from where he stands, and therefore this hiluch, according to Shimon, is not an avoda for which a machsheva poseles would passel the carbon on Reish Lakish. Moder Rabbi Shimon b'holochas chatos apnimis shel machsheva poseles b'urov avoda shein yochel vatla. In the case of a chatos apnimis, where you shecht the carbon in the azora, then you have to bring its dam into the heichal in order to do the zrika on the mizbeach hapnimi. Then we know that it's impossible to avoid and circumvent the need for halacha, and therefore halacha now in a chatzos hapnimis, even according to Reb Shimon, is upgraded to the status of an avodah such that a machshava haposeles would passel the carbon. So Gemara says, wait a minute, V'hamar Rabbi Shimon kol she'eino al mizbeach achitzon kishlomim ein chayavin ala mishum pigul. What are you talking about? You're telling me that there's machshavas pigul haposelis in the case of a holoch of a dam of a chatas haprimis. Rabbi Shimon holds there is no such thing as pigul during the various avodos of a chatas haprimis because it's not similar to shlomim. Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina moda hoya lifsol. In other words, this is what you call a brisket tzvei dinim. There are two dinim in pigul. One din in pigul that it passes the carbon. There's another din in pigul that the basar itself becomes a chiv karis, an isur achil of karis. And the Gemara now says that although, according to Rav Shimon, the machsheves pigul in the chatas hapnimis could not actually make the basar into pigul because it's not similar to shlomim, but nevertheless it does have the first halacha of pigul, namely the psul carbon, and that's derived from a kal v'chomer. Uma shalo lishman, in the case of a carbon chatas, and it matters not whether it's a chatas achitzon or a chatas pnimis, a machshava shalo lishma pasels lechatos shehuchshu b'shlomim. Even though we said that in the case of Shalol Lishma and Shlomim, the carbon is kosher, but nevertheless the Shalol Lishma in Chatos is a psul. So we see that it's a lot easier to generate a psul in Chatos than it is in Shlomim. Case in point is Shalol Lishma. Is chutz l'zmano, right, when he has a machshav of chutz l'zmano, which is machshavas pigul, b'shlomim, sheposel, it's pasels the korban in shlomim, is eno din sheyifsol bechatos. Now, why doesn't this Kal Vachomer go one step further and teach me that there's mamish pigul in the full sense of the word? It cannot teach me that Yechayev Kares, because the Kal Vachomer is based on the Shalol Lishma. And in Shalol Lishma, although there could be a psul korban, but nevertheless there is no such thing as a chiyuv kares. So, for example, if you would shecht a chatos, the Kohen shechts Shalol Lishma, and the chatos is possible, and then he goes ahead, or somebody goes ahead and eats the basar, he would not be chayiv kares. So, if we're deriving the halach of pigul in the case of chatos from a Kal Vachomer from Shlomim, Dayo Levam and Adin, we can't go beyond and say that the Kal Vachomer that's based on Shalol Lishma could also teach me a Chiyuv Kares, because Shalol Lishma doesn't generate a Chiyuv Kares. So in Pigul, it would not generate a Chiyuv Kares. The Ashkechan Chutzes Manu Chutzim Kol Minolan. Well, guess what? We had a derivation according to Reb Shimon regarding a Chatos HaPnimis. But what, and right, that that on the one hand, it's not similar to Shlomim, and therefore it doesn't generate a chiv kares for the achilas hapigul. But on the other hand, it passes the korban. And there are two types of machshavas pigul. The real McCoy, first class, full-fledged machshavas pigul is chutz l'zmano. What about chutz limkomo? How do we know that in the case of chutz limkomo, it would passel the korban, and apparently we couldn't derive that from Shlomim? So how does Reb Shimon derive that a chatas hapnimis becomes possible if the Kohen during any of the avodos has a machshava of chutz l'mkomo? So the Gemara says, "Ma lechutz l'zmano shekein kares." If you're going to want to say that you're going to learn chutz l'makomo from chutz l'zmano, that you can't do, because chutz l'zmano could generate a chiyuv kares, and that's, as I said before, the real McCoy pigul is chutz l'zmano. It generates a chiyuv kares b'achila, but chutz l'mkomo could passel the korban, but it doesn't generate a chiyuv kares. Even shalol l'shma. Oh, so now if you're going to derive the halacha of chutz limkoma from machsheves shalol lishma, which means that just like machsheves shalol lishma passes the korban in every case of a chatos, whether it's chitzono or pnimis, right? Chutz lizmano. So too, let's use shalol lishma to derive chutz l'mkomo. So Gemara says, no, you can't do that. Shekei noeg b'bama. We don't have a chutz l'mkomo in bama, because bama by definition is chutz l'mkomo. So there's certain periods in Jewish history where you were allowed to bring korbanos on your own private altar, and that's called zman heter bamos. And during that time, there's no such thing as pigul for a machshav of chutz l'mkomo, because there is no makom. You know, any place on the face of the earth could be suitable for a bama. So therefore, although a machshavah shalol lishma in chatos would passel even on a bama, but a machshavah chutz l'mkomo would not passel in a bama, because there ain't no such thing. So the Gemara says no. Shalol lishmon b'may noeg b'pesach v'chatos pesach v'chas v'bomelo karvu. We're going to derive the halacha of shalol lishma from Pesach and Chatos. There's no such thing as bringing a Pesach or a Chatos on a boma. And basically, these are sugyas at the end of Mseches Zevachim, and the Gemara establishes that only those karbanos that could be benedava will be subject or lend themselves to a hakrov and a bama. But there's no such thing as a nedava, not in Chatos nor in Pesach. Iboy sema hekeshahu, or perhaps alternatively, in the case of a Chatos Pnimis, I will passel the carbon with the machshavas chutz limkomo based on a hekesh. And the hekesh is shlishi zeh chutz lizmano, and pigul is chutz limkomo. So the pasuk is in Vayikra Zayin. It says ve'im he'achol yachel mipsar zevach shalom b'yom hashlishi l'choshev lo pigul yeh. This teaches us the halacha of pigul, and it says by Yom Hashlishi. Yom Hashlishi is an allusion to Chutz Lizmano, but then the Torah says pigul, right? Why the additional word pigul? I mean, if you already wrote by Yom Hashlishi, then I know it's pigul. But the answer is that the extra word pigul is coming to as a ribui to include chutz limkom. Now, in one pasuk, the Torah has chutz lizmano, chutz limkom. Apparently, there's an analogy between the two. There's an equation between the two, and that's going to be the hekesh that teaches me that just like chutz lizmano passes the carbon, even in the case of a chatos pnimis, so too chutz limkomo will passel a chatos ha pnimis. Now, with regard to Rabbi Shimon, who says that holacha could not generate a psul machshava because it's not absolutely critical, you could avoid holacha by doing the shechita next to the mizbeach. But nevertheless, Rabbi Shimon is moded in the case of a chatas hapnimis, if he would do the halacha with the wrong intention, that would passel the carbon. Why? Because halacha is absolutely critical in the case of a chatas hapnimis. The shechita is done outside, and then you take the dam inside. So you have to have halacha. Halacha. Omar Rava, im timtzi lomal Rab Shimon savalo kibrei. Rab Shimon holds like his son Rab Elazar. To Omar bein ha'ulam lemizbeach safon. Okay, now this is a chiddush of Rabbi Elazar because the Torah seems to indicate that the area directly across from the Mizbeach, that's considered Safon. Right? It's a little bit tricky because we usually think of Safon the north as going up, but with regard to the Migdash, Safon actually goes to the right. So immediately to the right of the altar of the Mizbeach, that's considered Safon. And the Torah says that with regard to Kodshe Kodshim in Vayikra Perek Aleph, Al Yerech HaMizbeach Tzafona, comes along Rabbi Elazar, and he speaks about Bein Ulam LeMizbeach. The Ulam is on the west side, and from the Ulam to the Yerech HaMizbeach Tzafona, there's a section in the middle which is called Bein Ulam LaMizbeach. Now, you and I would have said that's not called Tzafon, and he can't do the Shechita there, because Shechita of Achatos requires Tzafon, like Kodshe Kodshim. Comes along Rabbi Elazar, he says, no, even though there's a hefsek between the ulam and the keneged yerech hamizbeach, and that's called bein ulam mizbeach, even that area is considered safon. Ein machshava mo'eles ba'olochas chatos hapnimis, el mi pesach ulam v'lebifnim. Okay, now the Kohen is molich the dam of the chatos hapnimis into this area, which we said is the extension, according to Rabbi Elazar, of Yerach HaMizbeach, Tzafona, and he has the wrong intention. The halacha in this particular area, again, Beino Ulam LaMizbeach, could be avoided. How? Because, according to Rabbi Elazar, he could shech the carbon right there on the spot. And he's right near the Mizbeach, and therefore he could just do the Zrika on the Mizbeach without halacha. So therefore, Machsheva HaPoseles would not passel. So according to Rabbi Eliezer, Kodshe Kodshim could be shechted in that area, Bein Ulam Mizbeach. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda disagrees, and he says that Yerach HaMizbeach, what's it called? Safona is only that area that's immediately Safon to the north of the Mizbeach, but not that area above Bein Ulam Mizbeach. And therefore you couldn't shech the carbon over there, and there's no way of conveying the blood of the Chatas HaPnimis into the Hechel without going through that northern part. Just 1 second, without going through what? Just get he has a diagram here. Yeah, I was right. Do you follow? That area between the Ulam and Mizbeach does not lend itself to Shechita, because it doesn't, according to Rabbi Yossi, it doesn't have the status of Tzafon. And therefore, if you can't shech the carbon there, then by definition, you're going to have to carry the carbon through that area to get to the Mizbeach. So therefore, halacha becomes indispensable. And the only way of understanding that Reb Shimon, in the case of a Chatas HaPnimis, would say that there's Machshava Poseles in Holochas Adam, is if he holds like his son Reb Elazar. Now Rava goes ahead and he says the following. And we're talking now about the Shtel Lechem. I'm sorry, the Lechem Aponim. Now there's something called the Lavona, and that was on Shabbos removed from the Shulchan. The Shulchan is where the Lechem Aponim was. And the Lechem Aponim in the Shulchan was in the Mizbeach, in the Heichal Pnima. And what they would do is, every Shabbos, they would remove something called the Lavona, and they would bring it outside of the Heichal into, and onto, I should say, the Mizbeach HaChitzon, the Mizbeach HaNechoshes. The Imtim Tzalom Esavalok Rabbi Yehuda, Diamatoch Azor Mekadesh. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda's Shita is, this is a Gemara much later on in Zevachim, that the Ritzpas Ha'azara, which is between the Ulam and the Mizbeach, has the same status as the Mizbeach itself. You can actually burn the Eivarim on the floor, and you don't even have to do it on the altar, on the Mizbeach. Is therefore ein machshava moeles b'holochas siluk bazichin. If, let's say, he has in mind a machshavas pigul at the time that he's molech these bazichin are those the kalim that held on to the levona. So at that point, his machshava would not register at all. Elami pesach heichal v'lachutz. Why does it have to be pesach heichal milachutz? Because he could actually do the burning of the. I'm sorry, not burning. We're not talking about Ketores here. Right, the levon has to be brought onto the mizbeach. Yeah. He could do it on the ground itself because we're holding like Rabbi Yehuda. The imtim tzalomar savar kedushas heichal v'ulam chadahi. And if you're going to say that according to Reb Shimon, the kedusha of the inner part of the Beis Hamikdash, the heichal, is one and the same as the kedusha of the ulam, which apparently is a sugya in Masechta Eruvin, apparently, is then ein machshava mo'eles el pesach ulam vilachutz. Unless the Kohen has the improper intention when he brings these bazichin full of lavona from the actual beginning of the doorway of the ulam and outward until the end of the doorway of the ulam, which is apparently, how many amos is it? 5 amos. Okay, for this we have to go through the diagrams and so forth and so on, but we'll just summarize by saying that if he had the wrong intention while he was walking through the 5 amos of the depth of the ulam, that would not generate pigul, because pigul in the ulam is not effective because the ulam has the same exact kedusha as the heichal, which is the shita of Rabbi Yehuda. So pigul, therefore, will be ineffective, a machshavas pigul, outside the door of the ulam, because the levana can be burned immediately outside the door, according to Rabbi Yehuda. Therefore, the only place where a machshavas pigul would disqualify the lechem aponim would be in the actual doorway of the ulam. So in this picture, you have the doorway of the ulam. Bimtim salomer toch ha-pesach kilifnim. Whoa. Now we're even saying that even in the Pesach, it's considered sanctified with the same kedusha as the Azara, I believe. Just 1 second. Trouble is, I have here an English translation, which is a pain in the neck. I have a Hebrew translation, but I don't want to. We don't have that much time. Yeah, I think I was right when I said the Azara. No. That's not right. No. Forget about Azara. Talking about the Heichal. Yeah. B'imtim Salom B'tocha Pesach Kilifnim, and it has the kedusha of the Heichal. So even the 5 amos deep area of the doorway has the same kedusha as the ulam itself, right? That's the doorway to go into the ulam, and therefore it has the kedusha of the Heichal. So once again, he could have done the avodas halavona right there. He didn't have to walk and bring it. is then any machshava pibsiachas. El v'gdeo shotas yodo. The only time that machshavas pigul would be effective would be when he stretches out his hand in order to put the levona on the mizbeach. The shulchan may be placed in the doorway itself. The levona may be burned on the floor of the azor, immediately outside the doorway. The kohen conveying the levona needs only to reach out from the doorway with the levona in his hand, place it outside. So the only pigul intention that would register would be to validate lechem would be at that moment when he stretches his hand out to convey the levona outside. So now Rava says, "V'im tzalom esavar halacha shalo b'regel lo shmei holacha." Okay, that's going to be a sugya for the next Omud here. And what's he holding now? That holacha shalo b'regel lo shmei holacha. It's not enough to stretch your hand out. You have to actually walk towards the mizbeach, and then it becomes holacha with a machshava poselos. Ein machshava melos klal. Wow. So if you put all these combinations together, you come to the conclusion that according to Reb Shimon, there is no such thing as a machshava poseles of pigul when he carries the levona. Omalei abai le'amura de Rav Chizda boy minei Rav Chizda holacha bezar mahu. According to, one second, is this only according to Reb Shimon? Let me not make a mistake here. Right, just one second. I have no choice but to get to Masifta out. Mm. Oh, thank God he has a footnote on this, which I don't know. The English translation doesn't have it. He says, "Hanidon ha'im halacha ksher b'zarlo eno rak l'das Rabbi Shimon." So good, I was careful. I thought the Gemara was going quite to Rabbi Shimon. Elegam l'das chacham ha'sovim shemachshava poselos ba'halacha histapka Gemara ha'im keshem sheshchita kshera b'zar machshava shelo l'shma poselos. Excellent. This is the point we were missing. You can have an avoda that does not require a kohen, and yet a machshava would passel the carbon, and that's shchita, because shchita is ksher bizar, and nevertheless machshava shalo lishma poseles bahem. So therefore, the Gemara thinks that halacha could be ksher bizar, even according to the Chachamim who hold that a machshava poseles ba'halacha, because it's no different than shchita, which is ksher bizar, and yet a machshava haposelos pasels the carbon. Okay. Now we got our head on straight. I don't know. This is really a big disappointment here. I got to write a letter to the editor here. Amalek Shera. That halacha could be performed by a non-Kohen. Mikra Masayeni, I'll bring support from a pasuk by Yishgatura Pesach. By Yizriku HaKohanim Yadam Valviyim Mafshitin. Okay, this is a pasuk in Divrei Yomim. The Kohanim threw the dam that was in the hands of the one who slaughtered the sacrifice. Since a non-Kohen may slaughter a sacrifice, apparently indicates that he could also convey the dam to another Kohen who does the Zrika, right? Zrika requires a Kohen, that's for sure. But now the Gemara wants to say that as far as Kabbalas Hadam is concerned, as far as, Holachas Hadam is concerned, the same person who does the Shechita could also be Molech the Dam. And the guy who does the Shechita is not a Kohen. Masiv Rav Shimon. And now Rav Shimon is going to ask a kasha from a Brisa.